Peter, thanks for joining me today. Peter Moyle is a distinguished professor of fish biology emeritus. I'm not sure I got the order of the words right, but you've been at UC Davis for teaching for over 30 years, I believe, and you're still researching.
That's right.
And you were my advisor when I was a graduate student at UC Davis, and I'm currently teaching the fish biology class that you helped to develop for this year only. And so I just wanted to bring you in to talk a little bit about your life and how you wound up at UC Davis and the kinds of things that interest you as one of the preeminent fish biologists in California.
A preeminent fish biologist.
Well, that's what they say. That's what all the references.
Yeah, that's because I wrote a book on California fish, so people tend to know who I am.
I think that's true.
If they like fish.
I put that as a prop down here too. Shameless promotion for your. This is the book.
Yeah.
Inland Fishes of California, which is it's required reading for many.
Yeah, you can probably get it on Amazon as a used book for very cheap. It's been around for a while.
Yeah, $80. $80. It's still pretty expensive. It's highly coveted.
Amazing.
So let me ask you some questions about your life.
Sure.
How is it that you got interested in fish biology?
Well, it would seem inevitable given that my father was a fisheries biologist for the Minnesota Department of Conservation. And my mother also had a master's degree in aquatic biology, zoology, which is very unusual for that era back in the 1940s, so the early 1940s, late 30s when they were in graduate school. So I spent a lot of time with my dad out sampling fish. He didn't fish much, but we lived on a lake, so I had fishing gear and I fished almost every day. It just seemed very natural, although I have a brother who went to college and majored in foreign relations and spent his career in the Far East doing diplomatic stuff.
But the siblings diverged a little bit in their interests.
My two sisters both got PhDs, and they wound up both also being academic biologists.
And I believe that your family, like you told me a story about your family, like the way you developed your really focused study skills without being distracted by sounds or noise.
Sure. Well, yeah, I've discovered that was an unexpected benefit of being brought up the way I was. That we were in a small house, it's a converted summer cottage actually, and every one of us played a musical instrument, and every one of us practiced. And that included my father, who was a very bad violin player, but he practiced every day. And to do our homework, we had to sit around. We had just one room for the middle of the house. We sat around the dining room table and did our homework together, 4 kids, with somebody always practicing, often badly. So you learn to tune things out.
So this is really a tried and true technology for helping your children develop
practice
the ability to focus and concentrate in the midst of chaos.
Yeah,
it worked for your family.
It worked for my family. Yeah, yeah. I can't say I'd recommend it, but
so from an early age, you developed an interest in fish biology, and you got your PhD, and then you ended up coming out to California. What drew you out here?
Well, I came out to California because the job market was lousy at the time, and I had 2 job offers. I was interested mainly in teaching, and one of the job offers which I wound up accepting was at Fresno State University, or at Fresno State College as it was then. So my wife and I moved out to California. She was a high school teacher, so she started teaching high school in Fresno, and I joined the faculty at Fresno State. And if you don't know, if coming from a wet place like Minnesota, a wet, snowy place like Minnesota, to the dry, hot Central Valley was quite a switch. We really had, the internet didn't exist then, so it was hard to check up on what places were like. So I accepted the job because the interview was by telephone. I accepted the job. We drove out to California and found ourselves in this place that was different.
Almost a desert.
Almost a desert.
And so there you were, a fish biologist in the San Joaquin Valley. And where did you go from there in terms of
Well,
your research?
I've always interested in being out in the field. So I very quickly discovered, trying to read the literature, such as it was on California freshwater fishes, that fish biologists who are smart worked in one of two places. They either went up into the Sierras and work where it was cool and they work on trout and so forth, or they go over to the coast where it was cool, where to work on marine and estuarine fishes. And I sort of thought, well, if I want to publish papers, which I really enjoyed writing, what I wanted to do, the best thing I could do was to work someplace nobody else was interested in, which was the Central Valley.
Yeah.
Where it was hot in the summer.
Yeah. Very
hot. And I had an old van that once held all our possessions. It spanned and became my field vehicle. It was unair conditioned. Mm-hmm. But I've spent a couple of summers with student assistants wandering around the Central Valley sampling fish and the Sierra Nevada foothills. And that resulted in my first papers on California fish, which I found it was a really unique fish fauna. There's just nothing else like it. Most of the fishes, the native fishes, were found only in California. That really surprised me. I did not know that at the time. But I also noted that when you got to low elevations, the native fish fauna had pretty much been replaced by non-native fishes.
Even at that time.
Even at that time. And those non-native fishes were catfish and bluegill and bass. Sure. That fish I was brought up with in Minnesota.
Yeah, right.
So there's a certain amount of familiarity there.
Yeah, which must have helped a little bit when you're seining those streams and trying to figure out the minnow assemblage of California, for example, which was pretty much uncharted territory.
Oh yeah, it was. Right? But on my early memories of that, it was going out with a student who didn't know his fish very well, but he knew something about the fish, and seining a ditch actually. Mm-hmm. And I seined it up and said, I was very disappointed. I said, we just caught a bunch of golden shiners, which are not native fish. And he looked at me and said, I really think those are hitch. And I said, so I essentially said, I did not recognize hitch. And after all, I realized those are fish very easy to mistake for one another. But that was my first experience with either catching native fish in numbers on the valley floor, catching these hitch and not knowing what they were.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
I had the reverse problem at Pewter Creek last weekend. We caught a golden shiner. And I was like, is it a hitch? Is it a golden shiner? I had to look it up.
Yeah, you do it first if you don't work with them both.
I don't see them very often, especially the shiners,
Yeah.
So you found this really kind of unique assemblage that nobody had really described, and it seems like you kind of dove into that whole notion of California being a really unique place for fishes. And what makes them particularly distinct? What is it about California? And it's fun.
Well, the idea of California as an island, which is sort of in the California literature, is really true from a fish perspective. You have the big deserts over in the southeast. You have the coastal mountains that go all the way from Baja California to Oregon, which isolate the interior of California from the rest of the state, then the rest of the world. And then you have on the west side of the Sierras, east side of the Sierras, you have a fish fauna that is most closely related to the Great Basin, all the big deserts in Nevada and so forth. So essentially you have a fish fauna that's been isolated for millions of years. Yeah. Gone its own direction. And it was, as far as I was concerned, it was underappreciated.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And then, so you began writing about it, and this book came out of it, and many, many papers. And what have you seen happen to California endemic fishes over the past?
First thing I might point out, this book right here is the second edition, because the decision I made at some point, and I think in my second year at Fresno State, was that nobody knows anything about these fishes. No one summarized all the information. I'll write the book on California fish.
Yeah.
Very foolish thing to do.
Why is that? Because
it's not what any assistant professor in their right mind would undertake. But nevertheless, I did write the first volume on the first book on California fish, and it helped me develop my reputation as a fish biologist, which gave me access to lots of places. they gave me some respect in the fisheries agencies, so they're willing to help me out.
I see. So you wrote the book,
yeah,
essentially. And then why did you publish a second edition?
Oh, because one thing, there's a lot of mistakes in the first edition.
Which is just the price of
yeah.
boldness sometimes.
But in fact, the reason was we learned a hell of a lot in that period of time. That was 1976 when the Fishes of California was published. It was 2002 when the second version came out. And in that period of time, I filled in a lot of the blanks. For example, Delta smelt, which is one of the more important fish in California now, with just 2 paragraphs in the first book.
Okay.
We knew nothing about it.
And it certainly wasn't listed at that time.
And by the time I came out with the second version in 2002, it was one of the better known fish in California because it's in fact, it was in the middle of California's water system and it was listed as an endangered species, and that suddenly made it an important fish to study.
So we can go down that a little bit. How is it that so at that time, how is it you got involved with Delta smelt, and how did they catch your attention? Were they considered Delta smelt at that time?
Oh,
or were they thought to be pond smelt still?
Well, when I first arrived in the state, that was still controversial. I didn't know whether Delta smelt was really a different species or not. It was described as one, but it was described as Hypomesis transpacificus meaning across the Pacific Ocean, because the guy who described it, who was a good taxonomist, thought that the similar species as in Japan looked just the same as the Delta smelt here. And so he said, oh, it's one species with 2 populations on different sides of the ocean, which is absolutely crazy. It can't be, but anyway.
They do look a lot alike.
They do. Oh, yeah, sure they do.
But they're very distinct.
Very distinct, yeah. So the Delta smelt was one of those species that I started working with when I first arrived at UC Davis in 1972, because I wanted to fill in the blanks in my 1976 book. That was sort of one of the things that book was. It was sort of a plan for me where I needed to do work in order to improve, in order to make the book a good reference.
I see. So that was sort of like your strategic plan for your career.
Yeah, it turned out that way. And one of the things I did very early in the game was to go out with the Department of Fish and Game, as they were called at the time, who were doing sampling out in the Delta and in the San Francisco estuary. And I went out with them on their fall midwater trawl sampling program for this first year. Again, seeing all these fish, that's the first time I've seen Delta smelt. And they, in fact, were one of the commonest fish that they were capturing.
They were quite abundant.
They were quite abundant.
Whereas not
but they were studying striped bass and salmon. Yeah. Fortunately, the department had reasonably good biologists at the time who were willing to take data from the fishes that were not part of their contracts.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, so they took data. They measured all the fish they caught, including longfin smelt and Delta smelt.
And that's become an enormously valuable record.
Yeah.
40 years later. Yeah.
They had the longest running record of Delta smelt. And then they said, well, gee, I should study these. I need to get some publications out as an assistant professor. So they said, okay, we'll start saving these fish for you and bring them to you at the end of the sampling season, which was in January. In January pulls up, the guy comes along. I get a call from the Fish and Game people, Lee Miller in particular. He says, we want to deliver some fish to you. So they did. They came, and it was a truck. And it was full of bottles, several hundred bottles of pickled smelt. and so, unfortunately, they thought it was sort of funny. I wanted all these, but they came up with money so I could hire a research assistant, student assistant, to help to process these samples, to look at stomach contents and so forth.
And that hadn't been done.
That hadn't been done. So that made me the expert on Delta smelt right away, because the figures after that gave me a start on doing their life history studies, and I published a paper on their life history in 1992.
And they were just kind of considered bait fish at the time. Not really significant. There are a whole bunch of them, not really interesting, nothing unusual. thought to be maybe a subpopulation of another species.
Yeah.
So you did the first life history studies, and then soon you started noticing a change in catch, right?
Yeah.
Which, wasn't that related to work you were doing in Sassoon Marsh?
Yeah, it's a project that you now have, which is really
Yeah,
nice.
yeah, I picked that up. Yeah.
The Sassoon Marsh project was basically, I got started in 1979, and I had a graduate student who's interested in tule perch, one of our really unique native fishes. And we were looking around for places where the tule perch might be abundant, so he could do a complete life cycle of tule perch. And we discovered Sassoon Marsh. It was and you could be launching a boat, have a boat on campus and be launching it and be on the water in 45 minutes if you were lucky, which was really great. And plus, I discovered in my first year of sampling out there that there are lots of other fish that nobody knew anything about, like splittail, for example. So it just feels like a really good place to work if I could. And it turned out that the Department of Water Resources was in the process of planning to build a big tidal gate on the upper end of Sassoon Marsh to protect the duck clubs, the hunting facilities for hunters. At that time, most members of the state legislature were white men who liked to kill things. So the ducks had a lot of clout in the legislature. Now, I'm not kidding. That actually.
Yeah, right. This is dating from the 1800s. Really, that was the tradition of powerful men in California. So
anyway, Randy Brown, who was a really good scientist who worked for the Department of Water Resources, started funding the Sassoon Marsh project. And he was especially liked the idea that we always ran it with volunteers. We always had at least one student along every time we went out. And usually it was a couple of graduate students plus some undergrads. Tradition which is continued too. There's just an amazing number of people in this state who've been out on Sassoon Marsh.
I think it's probably been the single largest or the single most popular access into tidal wetlands in the region.
Yeah, I'm sure it is, because it's a great place to go, especially if you imagine yourself as a desk-bound bureaucrat. You studied fish, you thought you were going to be a field biologist. Here's a chance you can get out and spend a couple of days out in this really beautiful area, full of fish, full of birds. Just a great place to get out, and you see really interesting fish. So anyway, we started sampling Sassoon Marsh, 1979, doing the monthly sampling, which also was pretty unusual, because I was interested in the entire community of fish, not just one species. And after a few years, really quite rapidly, by the mid to late 1980s, we noticed the delta smelt had pretty much disappeared from our samples. It always takes you a while to notice this kind of thing, because they sort of just decline gradually in your samples. You just figure, oh, I'm just to add year class or something like this. So we started, at that time, Bruce Herbold was one of the students working with me. And so we started inquiring for all the various sampling programs around the Bay Delta system, what happened to delta smelt in their samples too. And it turned out every sampling program, everything from the fish captured in the pumps to the fall midwater trawl sampling to anything that was going on, it seems smelt just about disappeared from their samples. Since we discovered that became incorporated in this paper we were writing on the life history of the smelt. And I said, I've become the world's expert on delta smelt. I mean, no one else knew anything about them or cared.
Yeah.
So I really should, especially declining rapidly. They have a 1-year life cycle. They could disappear in no time. So I filed a petition with the Fish and Game Commission. They have a standard form you fill out if you want to get in a species listed as endangered. We then I came and made a presentation to the Fish and Game Commission, and what the surprising thing to me at that time was the Fish and Game Commission met in an auditorium with several hundred seats, and the first item on the agenda was listing the delta smelt, and every seat in that auditorium was filled.
Really?
Yeah, mostly members of all the environmental groups in California were there.
Really?
And the fishing groups. because they suddenly realized they had this is a possible handle on trying to get some control over California's water.
Because this was following the peripheral canal, which had been proposed in the late 70s, early 80s as a means of transporting water around the Delta. And that was a very controversial thing in the environmental community. And so they realized the opportunity with Delta Smelt to kind of end it.
That's right, because the Delta, one of the main sources of California's water was the massive pumping plants in the South Delta. And the finger was always pointing at those pumping plants as being responsible for the Delta Smelt decline, as well as the decline of other fishes and of water quality in the Delta in general. Yeah, right. Anyway, Fishing Game Commission, long story short, the Fishing Game Commission turned it down. There's an interesting stories behind that, but at that point, the local chapter of the American Fisheries Society had picked up my petition, slapped a cover letter on it, and sent it to the federal government, to the federal listing. And so then it became federally listed as an endangered, as a threatened species. It's a big.
The rest is history.
The rest is history. Yeah.
that listing probably had a bigger effect on California water politics than possibly any other move. It's the biological equivalent of building a dam, essentially, in terms of changing how water moves through the system. Well, anyway, how it's regulated.
It was unexpected. People did not know anything about the smelt, and here's this small, it's a great endangered species, a classic endangered species, small, insignificant critter in the middle of big human enterprise, and it's threatening to shut that enterprise down.
Yeah, a classic story. Do you think the environmentalists were right?
Well, the thing is that there are multiple factors affecting the smelt, of which diversions are certainly one of them. And the smelt's on the verge of extinction now.
Partially climate change, partially export, partially invasive species, and declines in food webs. All these are sort of smoking guns in the story of the Delta smelt, which is a surprisingly complicated story.
That's right. Yeah. That's right.
And for a 1 year lived species has a surprisingly complicated life history as well.
Yes, and that's one of the beautiful things about this, though. The amount of research that got done on Delta smelt, making it one of the better understood estuarine fishes, was really incredible.
I was remarking on that to myself the other day, too. We got a huge amount of research out of the Delta smelt before their imminent extinction here. And we know a lot about things we didn't know about, like how small small organisms without the ability to swim very well manage to retain their position in estuary, how they can migrate up and downstream, how they can manage a 1 year life cycle with occasional 2 year jumps in between to maintain some kind of heterogeneity amongst in the population and hedge the bets for survival. Sure. All these things came out of Delta smelt. I think it's very cool.
It is cool, and it also led to studies of other native fish in the system, like spliptail.
Right.
So they had a lot of benefits, and also I just discovered at one point, somebody asked me about, somebody did some research on this. It turned out to be a major source of employment for people who wanted to work in the Big Delta system, because if you had you were an academic and you had a research program, you could work on Delta smelt and have a pretty good idea you get funded, no matter what it was you were working on.
That could be responsible for a number of careers, possibly my own.
Well, if you draw this basic curve of numbers of Delta smelt through time, the curve goes down. You draw a curve on the number of publications on Delta smelt. It goes up.
Yes.
There's a direct negative correlation between the number of smelt and the number of publications.
Very possibly we killed them with all our publications.
Yeah, the sheer weight of those, my God.
The sheer weight. Correlation is causation, right?
Right.
So the Delta smelt was kind of the first species, but that was one of the kind of big red flags that you saw back in the early 80s. But over time, you become concerned about a lot of other species as well. And so what have you noticed about California endemic species over the past few years?
Well, the number of species I currently list on my overall list of California native fishes and includes species and subspecies and distinct populations, ones that are managed as species, basically. There are 130 in California. 80% of those 80% of those fishes are endemic to California. They're found only in the state. Maybe including that, I mean, add a few of the watersheds sneak out of the state a little bit into Oregon and Nevada, but basically these are all California endemics. And that means the state has a huge responsibility to take care of these fish, you would think anyway, because what's happened is that the Delta smell is just sort of the harbinger of what's been going on. All the 80% of these native fishes are in decline. And there's already about 30 species that are listed as endangered species by the state and federal government. So it's not just me, it's not just my research that's pointing it out. It's been gotten to be pretty obvious now that the entire fish fauna is in decline. And there are now 50 species of non-native fish in the state. And they're partly responsible for the decline, or else and at the very least, they're responsible for making it very difficult for these native fish to recover their populations if you improve the habitat and so forth.
So what kind of measures do you think are critical to help reverse some of these declines?
Well, I think the main thing is you have to have the appropriate habitat for them, especially you have to have cool water. And increasingly that water is behind dams. So we have to be appropriating water specifically for native fish. And that includes salmon, so it shouldn't be that hard. But we also need to establish at least a system of reserves around the state for fish. One of the things that becomes pretty obvious when you look at the distribution of fish around California, that these native fishes are found in all different parts of the state. Each part of the state has its own endemic fauna. So it's not just they're not only endemic to California, they're endemic to a specific part of the state. That means ideally in every part of the state, you should have reserves, aquatic reserves that are set up to protect the native fish. Because if you protect those native fish, you're also protecting a whole slew of native invertebrates that are also endemic. You know, the fish get all the attention.
That's a really interesting idea. And of course, marine reserves have already started to be established. Well, that was a pretty controversial idea 20 years ago, which has proven to be quite successful, I think, by a number of measures. So how would you establish a sort of freshwater inland fish reserve? Would you have streams or headwaters that are set aside?
I think this is the idea of taking this from the marine people and talk about freshwater protected areas. Because, and that would have to include a wide variety of sources. It can't just be headwaters. That's, as a matter of fact, right now, that's the one habitat that is fairly well protected, are headwaters, because they tend to be in national parks, like on the Sierras, or in protected watersheds because of drinking water. The fish that are in trouble, the lower in the elevation you get, the more likely the fish are in trouble. So that means you have to specifically look at each region of the state and look at the different kinds of streams and stream habitats and kind of protect at least a sample of everything. And that's not that hard to do. I mean, it's obviously hard in terms of the difficulty of purchasing land and getting water rights and so forth.
Right.
But
so each freshwater reserve would essentially have land on the borders, probably some private stakeholders as well who bought in, and then also have some kind of water rights to be able to manage flows within the reserve to make it effective.
No, I figured back in the 1990s when I first thinking about this, I wrote a paper which sort of cataloged all the different kinds of aquatic habitats in California. And I came up with about 150 discrete habitat types that would need to be protected if you really wanted to save the native fish fauna and all these endemic invertebrates as well.
I have not seen that.
Well, it's been widely ignored.
I guess we'll have to open that one back up again. So thinking locally, taking that idea locally to Davis, you were involved in the Peter Creek restoration as well, right?
Right.
And that's a riparian preserve that runs through campus. What was the state of Peter Creek when you found it?
Well, this Peter Creek makes a great story, especially since you just had your field trip last week on to Peter Creek, because it was that field trip that I started doing with the class in the mid 1970s. After I've been here 3 or 4 years, just because I needed some place to take the class that had fish.
Yeah.
And so I started taking the students there, doing everything that you were doing. We started doing them with every piece of gear we had. We'd bring down there and demonstrate it and sample the fish. That became a yearly data set that turned out to be the only long-term data available on how flows in the creek affect fish populations. So the student collections turned to be very important. So these field trips part of a tradition that collected data that helped save the creek. Because what had happened, it was a gradual process. When I first arrived, on campus, and my wife and I went down to Peter Creek to take a look at it because I was thinking of places to take field trips. And there was all this big yellow, it's on campus, big yellow machinery in the creek because the university was mining gravel from the creek.
Oh, really?
And there's just a little trickle of water going along one edge. And one thing, I would go there in the evening, I remember a beaver swimming up this trickle. I said, how can an animal actually make it? So I got very discouraged. I figured Peter Creek could be used. But I also started working with several people, especially Steve Cheney, with the idea of a campus reserve. Even though it was, and the first thing one of the things we asked, we went into the chancellor in town, to Ed Spafford, and the guy in charge of buildings and grounds, and asked if the university could stop mining gravel from the creek.
Okay.
And they never said they would, but they did. About 2 years after we asked it, and I suspect they had some legal issues about mining in the creek too. They probably may not have had all the permits they needed, but whatever, they stopped mining of the creek. And it's amazing how fast things started coming back because there was water still coming down the creek for various reasons. And the riparian vegetation started growing back. It's mostly non-native stuff, but it was great for birds.
Yeah.
In fact, the pools created by the gravel mining operation turned out to be great for fish because you have it was a kind of habitat otherwise would not be present if you just had this little trickle of water. But here we had a couple of big deep pools right there on campus.
Interesting. So the stream itself was kind of a trickle, but you had these ponds that had developed.
And in fact, one thing you may have noticed if you're out there today, you can wade across the creek in many places, most places. At that time, when we first started out, there's 2 big pools there right by where the picnic ground is. Those pools were 10 to 12 feet deep.
Oh, really?
And so we had some very different gear we used, and we caught a lot more fish. But at any rate, getting back to the story of
the story,
I tell this because I want students to know that it's possible that even as a student, you can collect data that might be important.
And we collected the data ourselves, and it's part of that tradition. We keep it. It's all in a database.
So, but what happened was that in the 1980s, the creek started to dry up. And at the same era when the Peter Creek Council was formed, which was a local environmental group, it formed mainly because they could see some possibilities in the creek as a recreational facility, as a place for nature. And they said, we got to form an organization to clean up all the trash in the creek. Well, it turned out to be an organization that had a lead role in trying to getting flows back into the creek, because in the 1980s, you had a big drought, the creek started to dry up, and these big pools became the main refuge for fish. And even there, there were fish kills going on. So that started this whole process of kind of trying to save the creek. And the university became an important player because by that time, the university had declared the Peter Creek to be a riparian reserve.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, so it's a riparian reserve now.
Yeah, right. So they've gone full circle.
So the university now had a stake in the creek, because we made the case, using the class again, that this is important for research and teaching.
Okay.
So again, the student use of the creek was one of the reasons to save it.
Right.
And so as things went on, the Sono Water Agency at that time was very hostile to any use of their water that was not for human use, because we were obviously requesting more flows down the creek. So they were sued under some sections of the Fish and Game Code.
5937, right?
5937, yeah.
And it was the Peter Creek Council, it was the university, and City of Davis?
City of Davis, yeah. You have to realize it's very unusual, especially for the university to get involved in an environmental lawsuit.
Yeah.
It's almost never done.
Yeah.
But the chancellor at that time, Chancellor Meyer, thought, I guess he thought we made a good case. And the university's involvement was very important, because we had a trial in 1996. We had a trial in the local Superior Court. And the university actually invested a lot of money in that, in hiring lawyers. They hired some really good water lawyers who are much better than obviously the Peter Creek. Peter Creek had some lawyers, but they were pro bono lawyers from a big law firm who were just starting out.
Okay. Okay. So you got some hot shots.
So the university hired especially one really good attorney who's always in the background advising people.
Interesting.
Made a big difference.
And then you testified during that.
Yeah, that's when we had the trial. It was very, very dramatic. I spent 2 days on the stand being cross-examined, because the trial did depend on fish. You want to water the creek for the fish, and because the fish were part of this anyway. They all fit in. I was the expert on the fish, so I got to be on the stand. And you realize that being an expert witness on a trial is a very poor way to communicate information. The kind of information I got across in 2 days of cross-examination was probably what I could give in a 1 hour lecture.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, it was successful. And the star of that trial was Steve Cheney, who had been a graduate student when I first arrived, and had been involved with the Peter Creek Council and so forth, because of his expertise on flows and riparian vegetation. Anyway, I won't get into that, but he gave the key testimony that really turned the mind of turned things around. But once that happened, the judge awarded a flow regime. I had worked with Michael Marchetti, who was a student, and a bunch of other people to develop a flow regime for the creek. And the judge awarded that flow regime with some
wasn't a lot of water necessarily.
No.
It was all about timing, right?
Yeah, that's right. It was a flow regime. It wasn't just flow, it was a flow regime. That was the whole idea, was to have a flow regime that'd be good for native fish.
And this idea had really never been tested anywhere, had it?
No,
it was
not really.
Hypothesized at that time.
Yeah,
so this is kind of a test case in a way. And what did the flow regime consist of? Fall attraction flows?
Yeah, fall attraction flows for salmon. There were on the 6-week pulse of higher flows in the spring for spawning and rearing of native fishes, which is I think is going on right now. I'm sorry, it was going on before. The fall attraction flows.
Yeah, the fall attraction flows.
Yeah, sorry, because
we're in the middle right now.
We had a really weird time with that big storm. But there's now where they're releasing.
It feels like it should be spring.
Yeah, that's right. Anyway,
After atmospheric river.
Being confused about this, but as the fall attraction flows, the spawning and rearing flows for native fish, and a living stream all the way down to the Yellow Bypass.
Right.
So at that time, the creek was drying up on a regular basis once you got down below the low water bridge, Old Davis Road.
Amazing.
So that we got that flow regime, and we also had asked for big blowout flows periodically to do the work of a stream, you know, to sculpt it and so forth.
Which happens during high flow years, right?
Yeah. The judge refused to not award that, to the great relief of the water agency, because they could imagine the middle of a drought and being required
right.
to release some blowout flows. So they got one thing out of that.
Yeah, but now it happens on wet years, and Solano County Water has really changed its approach to the creek as well.
Yeah, you put your finger on a very important thing there, is that the Solano County Water Agency, after being the bad guys in this trial, it had a complete turnabout, change of face. They decided not to appeal, even though they thought they had a good case, but they decided not to appeal, and instead became a good friend of the creek.
Yeah, they've been a great partner.
Yeah, they really see a living stream as being a benefit to the community, and one of the things they should be responsible for. No, that's been one of the most pleasing parts of this whole long story of Peter Creek, is the water agency is now the agency that is doing the most good for the creek, including they now have hired the stream keeper. That's the person whose full-time job was looking out for the creek. And initially the stream keeper was being paid sort of indirectly by part of the money that came out of the lawsuit. But the Solano Water Agency essentially said, look, the stream keeper might as well be a full-time employee. We're working with him anyway. And if he works directly for us, we can give him benefits. You can't, it's much harder to get, we're doing it on your own. And it's really worked out well.
I mean, I think that's the epitome of what you called reconciliation ecology, right? Where different stakeholders get together and they make active decisions about how to manage an ecosystem. For multiple benefits for multiple people. That's
right. And also you accept the idea that the stream is not really a natural system anymore. It's very different from what it was historically. It's very different from the one the native fishes evolved in. So you have to find ways to manage it, and manage it intensively to favor, if you want to favor the native fish.
Yeah. And the neat thing about Peter Creek is it works.
It works, yeah.
It really does work.
Yeah.
It's a pretty vibrant place. So I want to switch gears a little bit. We've talked a lot about your career. I don't know if you still have energy, but I know that you made a point of telling me you want to talk a little bit about your work on floodplains and the Cosumnes River bypass. And
well, the floodplains are something that I first really got acquainted with the importance of floodplains in California through all my reading on California fishes, and realizing that annual flooding or flooding every few years was a natural part of the valley ecosystems, and species like splittail especially were really adapted for this kind of thing. So trying to get some kind of a flood regime, trying to restore floods seemed like a good idea. And the person who really brought that to my attention was Ted Sommer, who got his PhD with me, and his PhD dissertation, working for the Department of Water Resources, was on the value of the Yolo bypass as a flooded area, because it flooded periodically, because that's what it was designed to do. The Yolo bypass is a bypass for floodwaters, and so it was functioning as a floodplain. And it was functioning perfectly well, but Ted decided to look into it to see if it had any value for fish. And it turns out it did. It turned out if you're a baby salmon, you got on the floodplain at the right time of the year, you got on the floodplain, and when the flooding was going on, you knew how to handle it. You get in there, there's lots of food, you grow like gangbusters. Then as the floodwater started to subside, they would bail out of the system. They always could find a way out. And that basic model has really grown now. But what it led to was my getting together with Jeff Mount, who was a geologist, to get a big grant to look at a natural floodplain in California, which was on the Cosumnes River. Because what I wanted to do especially, but this was our basic idea behind this whole thing, was to take a more natural floodplain and really find out how that's working. To use that as providing information and background for managing more modified floodplains. And so we spent 5 years out there sampling fish during the flooding period. And it was fun for me because it was one of the last projects I was involved in, which I was out on the field most of the time doing a lot of this. I insisted I had to get out there and be part of the field teams.
Yeah.
Even though Pat Crane, my person in charge, wasn't always happy to have me there. But Pat was great. He was a really good biologist. Anyway, this was a project that really provided the basic background on how floodplains work from a fish perspective in California.
And then you became an expert on floodplains and fishes. And didn't you get asked to go to Africa to look at floodplains?
Yeah, well, that was part of my work on the Okavango Delta in Botswana came about because of a dispute between Botswana and the upstream countries from the Okavango River, and they wanted to bring in. They brought in a bunch of experts on flows and floodplains and so forth to try to get these countries together to tell them about the importance of these things. Although some of their local people knew better than we did. Tell them the importance of floodplains, the importance of a flow regime. The Peter Creek stuff came in here too. The importance of the right flow regime to maintain, in this case, not only native fishes, but hippos and giraffes and all the standard African fauna, elephants, termites. And I use this as an excuse to go out with a class from the University of Botswana and spend a couple of weeks sampling fish in the Okavango Delta. And happened to being there, one reason I wanted to do it, I was there just at the time when the annual flooding was happening. And this is a very different system, in that the floodwaters come off the mountains. In Angola, where you have rainforest, comes down this long, just a couple hundred miles downstream, and finally winds up in this dead end, which is the Okavango Delta. But you can actually watch the floodwaters come in, and they aren't coming in as a big roaring flood, but they're coming in as this sort of trickle of water that spreads out across the landscape, and you can just watch it move. We were actually out there sampling the front of this flooding. And the interesting thing, there were little cichlid fishes there that were live bearers, and that would come out. They were right there giving birth, laying their eggs and having their juveniles, brooding their juveniles right in the floodwaters that's coming out. Because clearly there's a lot of food right in that first, all the terrestrial insects.
And just rapidly taking advantage of that. Oncoming floodwater. That's incredible.
Well, the Okawangos has incredible productivity because of these annual floodwaters. Anyway, that was a very different kind of experience.
Very different.
After all, that was my favorite experience that came out of that was going out with this crew sampling fish with gill nets and catching a crocodile in the gill net. This is about a 6-foot crocodile.
Okay.
And I climbed up on the back of the boat with my camera.
And took pictures?
Took pictures while
the rest of the crew struggled with the crocodile?
Yeah, that's right. I wasn't going to mess with that.
Leave it to the experts.
Yeah, leave it to the experts.
Did you lose anyone, or you managed to get the crocodile? Well, I've kept you here for quite a long time, but I have 2 more questions for you, if you still have energy for it. Yeah. What is, you have this really wide, diverse career. You've explored a lot of fun things. What are you most proud of?
What am I most proud of? Besides my daughter, who's a very wonderful and successful person, and my grandkids.
That she is.
What am I most proud of? Really, Peter Creek comes down to it, because that was such a wonderful community involvement thing, and had so many impacts later on. And the fact it's in my own backyard.
Yeah, it really strikes a note with me. It's very bioregional, very much focused on your watershed, right?
Yeah, and that of course led to this bioregional project we had for 5 years too, where I was working with an English professor, and I were gotten together and organizing this bioregion project with several other people, and there were 5 of us all together, which is to get artists from Davis and so forth to go up into the upper watershed. and have art displays, and art shows, and for us to go up and talk to people. And it wasn't a very big success, but it was a lot of fun.
Well, you have had some experience and some success collaborating with folks on the other side of the science humanities barrier, right? You worked with Gary Snyder. You did something similar with Gary, right?
Oh, sure.
In terms of having retreats up in the Sierra and talking about biology, bioregionalism, and poetry. Yeah,
well, I taught. I co-taught for a number of years a field course in nature and culture, which is great fun. I take these English majors out and show them how to electrofish.
That's a fabulous thing. Everybody should do it.
Yeah,
everybody should write poems once, and everybody should electrofish once in their life.
Right.
It should be on everyone's bucket list.
It should be. It should be. It's great fun.
All right. And my last question for you is, you always come back to writing. You always talk about papers and books, and it's something that is just part of the fabric of your life. And you seem to be someone who really likes to write. And do you have any advice for young scientists and writers about what's worked for you over the years and how to develop a practice of writing?
Well, I think my basic advice is just do it. And that's very hard, obviously, because writer's block is real. But part of that is just, I'm convinced that I got used to writing, and find it almost something I had to do. Was that as soon as I left home after I graduated from college, graduated from high school and then college, I wrote my mother a letter every week because she wanted to know what I was doing. Telephones were expensive then, so we didn't have much money. So writing a letter was something. It was a discipline. Every week, I'd have to have it. Usually Sunday evenings, I'd sit down and write this letter. And I'm convinced that that discipline of just writing, knowing I had to say something to her every week, really got me into this idea that writing is something you can do, especially if you just do it on a regular basis.
Yeah, it makes it approachable.
And also, I realized as a scientist, it's a lot of fun to be out in the field and do all these things, but it doesn't do any. You have to go beyond just having the fun of doing that. You have to write these stuff up so other people can learn what you've learned in the system. But you just have to get out there and be determined to do it. For a lot of people, it's just not that important to do the writing. A lot of the folks that get hired by agencies tend not to spend a lot of time writing, even though they may have to required to write reports. They often are not very good, or they're very brief, or they don't write them at all. So what job you have eventually, getting those things down on paper that you've learned, it's really important.
And there's a whole bunch of institutional knowledge that gets ensconced at the agencies. And when people retire, we lose it a lot because there's amazing experts that work all up and down the state. And the knowledge goes with them sometimes when they retire.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so it's another advantage to trying to get some of these ideas down.
And it's possible there are lots of places to publish these days. And we're in an era where you have blogs and other things online too. So writing those kind of things certainly is a help as well.
Yeah.
But you just have to get the habit of doing it.
Okay. Well, thank you. Anything else? Have we missed anything that you really wanted to share? I think we've hit all the bases.
You hit a lot of the bases. Sure.
All right. It's been a pleasure, Peter. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you, John.
Thanks for being my mentor all these years. It's been fun.
Well, I'm just so happy that the Susan Marsh project is still going.
It continues on and on.
Yeah.
And on. Yeah, it's doing great well. So thank you.
Thank you.
All right.